Please welcome to the stage Axios Richmond reporter Sabrina Moreno.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this very chilly evening, and for everybody tuning in on the live stream. Also, thanks for showing up and tuning in. My name is Sabrina Moreno, and I'm the Axios Richmond reporter, which if you are not subscribed to our daily newsletter yet, feel free to. It's free. And you can find us at axios.com/Richmond. We keep it simple over here. But this morning, we're excited to hear from several leading voices in Virginia's energy landscape about the future of this industry in a time of very rapid change and under a new administration. And so first up, I'd like to welcome somebody that you are all likely very familiar with, the former director of energy for Virginia and now the principal and founder of Davis Energy and Infrastructure Strategy Group, Glenn Davis.
Sabrina, thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming. Happy to have you. So we will start off with everybody's favorite energy topic.
Yes.
Data centers. So Virginia is trying to attract massive data center investment while also promising to rein in on consumer energy costs. But in your opinion, where is that balance most at risk right now? Like, are we talking generation, transmission, rate design, or something else, and why?
Kind of a little bit of all of the above. But one thing that's very important was always to create the balance with data centers. We want them, they are a huge economic driver in Virginia. Obviously, we want to win the AI race in this nation, and it's a national security issue. And Virginia has always been the data center capital of the world. 70% of all data center traffic in the world comes through Virginia. Internet traffic in the world comes through Virginia. But we need to make sure that the data centers carry their own weight. And there was a recent JLARC study a couple years ago that said they were. Under the Youngkin administration, we had the conversations of, look, we want to grow this, but they have to come and carry the weight of the cost of that new generation. And we even formed something called the Governor's Collaborative. It's the PJM states. And we came together recently working with the White House on a set of principles that came out that said data centers need to hopefully bring their own power generation. If they don't bring their own power generation, PJM will basically procure the power generation. The cost will then be assigned to the data center. So under the Youngkin administration, we've always been very concerned to make sure that we're able to meet that balance. We want to continue being the preeminent place for data centers. We want the economic growth in our localities, but we also want to hold the ratepayers harmless for that growth in generation costs. And I think we've done a great job with it.
And if we were to get that balance wrong, moving forward, who pays for it, or who do you think should pay for it?
It depends on which way we get it wrong, right? So if the new administration doesn't hold data centers accountable to carry their weight, the ratepayers, you, I, and the other residential owners pay for it. If we get it wrong in the other direction and basically force data centers out of Virginia, then citizens in localities pay for it. I mean, we have localities where 40% of their property taxes come from data centers. I mean, imagine what your house property tax bill would be in these localities without the data center. And then also imagine a locality in Southwest Virginia or Central Virginia where if they had one data center would change quality of life overnight. I mean, new schools, new roads, what it would do. So it's very important we get it right in the middle with equilibrium, because either way is going to harm Virginians.
And speaking of that risk, that balance, what is the single policy change this year that's been on your mind that would actually reduce that risk and not just study it?
Well, I mean, obviously, you see a lot of anti-data center bills, right? The moratorium stuff out there. And they have to be careful. I mean, Virginia doesn't exist in a vacuum. If Virginia literally goes out there and says, we don't want more data centers and we're going to make it hard to come here, there are a number of states right now that are just licking their lips, waiting for Virginia to shut down data centers in Virginia because they're ready to welcome them. I mean, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, I mean, you talk to these states and they're watching Virginia because they're ready to strike and take that opportunity if Virginia's going to push them out the door.
And looking at the current General Assembly and new leadership, what is one energy policy decision in the next year that you think will matter most for consumers, even if it's not getting the most headlines right now?
So, and it has been discussed in the past. It may not be on the table right now. Well, we'll go with one that is on the table, RGGI. I mean, so the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. This is something that the last Democratic governor put Virginia in. And 2021 to 2023. Over $800 million in penalties were passed to ratepayers. Everyone's bills went up to cover that $800 million. It's not speculative. It's exactly what happened. By the way, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative was meant to actually lower carbon dioxide emissions. In reality, my team did the analysis. It increased carbon dioxide emissions by over 2 billion pounds compared to not being in RGGI. And the reason why, and Dominion will tell you this, Dominion stopped using their natural gas plants as much in Virginia and used their coal plants in West Virginia more often. We all know the difference in emissions between natural gas and coal. And last time I checked, we don't have a bubble over Virginia. So we don't have to speculate what will happen. We have empirical evidence, and we know for certain that Virginia going back in RGGI will cost Virginians $500 million a year every year we're in there. You want to make our bills stay down? Keep us out of RGGI.
And how do you kind of balance the concerns, environmental concerns, pollution concerns that people have in communities about greenhouse gases in kind of thinking that long-term, investment, that long-term risk that people think about?
Sure, we're going increasingly clean. Virginia's using more solar today. Even under Youngkin, we put more solar out there. We're going down the path of SMRs. Natural gas is becoming cleaner. If we spent as much time banning stuff and put that time into helping these technologies become cleaner, we'd actually have the best of both worlds. We'd have plenty of power and cleaner emissions. But instead, the legislature back in 2020 decided, no, we're just going to ban it. I mean, Virginia right now is sitting on state code that says in 2045, all natural gas emissions will become, or all natural gas power generation will be zero in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And in Dominion and APCO territory, 2050. And just to kind of put this on where we are, 55% of all of our power today in Virginia is natural gas. So you think that this scares us as residents? Imagine a company coming here, and you're trying to get them to come to Virginia and create thousands of new jobs, and the first thing out of your mouth is, oh, by the way, we might lose 55% of all of our power in 20 years. It doesn't go over very well.
And I mean, that's something that's a major divide in the energy space, right? Fossil fuels. And you've described previously your philosophy as an all-of-the-above approach. But as Virginia scales up to meet that AI-driven demand and data center growth, what are the conditions that you imagine, or the specific conditions that would have to happen where you would think fossil fuels stop being a default option, or it becomes something that the state actively moves away from?
Well, I mean, once again, I think we have to understand, the fossil fuels themselves are not the harm, right? I mean, people want to say, well, it's the emissions. Well, if it's the emissions, let's work on that technology. And if you talk to the industry, they already are. I mean, natural gas is so much cleaner today than it was a decade and 2 decades ago. And they're already working on renewable natural gas and other things that make it even cleaner. I mean, let's incent the industry to continue going down that path. Why shut down a resource that we've been blessed with in this nation to continue and grow energy dominance? If our concern is cleanliness, let's work and continue to invent and incent the innovation to make it cleaner. That's what we should be doing, not shutting it off. I mean, so one thing we have to understand to this point is there's always been this discussion of can renewables replace fossil fuels? The answer unequivocally is no. So when you build an energy grid, you don't build it based on how much energy you use over the course of the year. You build it on how much energy you need on the hottest of hot days and the coldest of cold days. And during peak hours. Peak hours in Virginia are 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. The sun's not up at its height at 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. And unless someone can tell me what the wind's going to do on February 27th, 2028, we need to have something that we can rely on. And that happens to be natural gas. There's a place for solar. There's a place for all the above. There's a place for everything. But let's understand, if we want to make sure our lights come on, we need to have dispatchable power. And right now, that is natural gas. And when I first took the job in Virginia, I used to say, well, we need to keep the lights on. Let's understand it's not about keeping the lights on. In Texas, when they had that winter storm, people died because people's heaters would not come on in their homes. And the elderly are the first to be affected. That's what this means if we get this wrong. So we shouldn't be fighting the one dispatchable power that literally was responsible for keeping our lights on this last storm that we had.
So to me, the view that natural gas is essential today gets at how the overall system is designed. And feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but if that's true, what's the right way to create variability in not just the worst case scenarios, but all the time without overbuilding gas?
Well, I mean, look, so you want to have the variability. So Youngkin was always big on battery storage and energy storage. And that, I think, is going to be very important. And we see it under the Youngkin administration. On the way out the door, we funded a project in Rappahannock Electric Cooperative and helped them build a battery project where literally they were going to power the batteries up during the middle of the day when power was at least expensive because solar's plentiful in the middle of the day, right? And then they were going to draw down the battery during peak hours, 4 to 8 p.m., when electricity is most costly. There are innovative things we can do. Now, battery storage still has a lot of innovation to go through to really be where we'd like it to be and be that significant impact. But today, it can start to make the difference. And I think there are innovative solutions out there like that that we were using under the Youngkin administration that can continue to be a part of this growth.
And would you say, do you think, are we risking building infrastructure that could be harder to operate or politically harder to sustain, 20 years from now?
Politically harder to sustain?
Regardless of administration, because especially since this is something that sometimes falls along party lines.
You're right, and it shouldn't, honestly. I mean, look, one of the biggest natural gas states in the nation is Pennsylvania. Governor Josh Shapiro. You don't see Governor Shapiro shutting down natural gas? I mean, this shouldn't be partisan. It shouldn't be political. We need our lights to stay on. We need our AC to stay on, our heat to stay on. We need economic growth in Virginia. It shouldn't be partisan. We need all the above. There's a place for solar. There's a place for wind. There's a place for everything. And that's what people need to understand. You are not going to replace all fossil fuel consumption with renewables and think that you're going to have a reliable grid, or an affordable one, at that matter.
And since we're under, a new administration, and you were the head of the state's Department of Energy, during the transition period, did you offer the Spanberger administration recommendations? What work did you recommend they continue or prioritize?
So the transition team I was asked to meet with was an amazing transition team. I knew them before, great people. They were coming in, they asked all the right questions, kind of where things are, and we did. And this administration has to make their decisions. They won the election, they have a right to govern and decide future policies. And one thing that I hope they lean into, and we saw bills already during the legislature, but Governor Spanberger has not weighed in on a lot of things yet, is I hope they look at the Virginia Clean Economy Act. I mean, when the State Corporation Commission staff in testimony says that they cannot reconcile affordability and the Virginia Clean Economy mandates, if that doesn't send up fire alarms, nothing does. I mean, when I was head of the department, we modeled many different ways the Virginia Clean Economy Act, trying to see, can we keep the lights on and adhere to the mandates? And the answer is no. And the one technical model that's come about was forced to be created using unicorns and fairy dust that cannot stand up to any type of discussion. It doesn't exist, and it can know, if when the SEC staff comes out and says, we have a reconciliation problem with affordability and these mandates, that should send a storm through the administration saying, we need to create some changes. And I will give my Democrat colleagues credit. I didn't like the bill and vote for it in 2020, but in 2020, we thought there was a 1% to 2% energy year-over-year growth. It's over 6.5% now. That bill was not created for what we're seeing today.
And as you're thinking of this, where do you think lawmakers right now in this current session are getting it right? And where would you say that maybe they're not hitting the mark?
They're getting it right with conversations behind closed doors. Having been elected to office for 15 years, 10 in the General Assembly, there's a difference between the speeches given on the floor of the House of Delegates and the conversations behind closed doors. There are the right conversations going on. I don't know if those conversations will ever become the conversations on the floor and turn into legislation that actually lowers the bills. I mean, if we want to lower the bills for consumers in Virginia overnight, literally overnight, starting this September, all we have to do, not go into RGGI, and basically allow existing nuclear to be in the numerator of the RPS, because that would stop us from making Dominion buy basically between $3 and $5 billion of renewable energy credits, all of which will get passed on to the consumer over the next 10 years. So literally, this administration could lower bills significantly by a simple administrative change.
And one last question to end it all for now. If a year from now, what should Virginians look at to decide whether this administration's energy policy is actually working? What's the metric?
Look at their bill. Look at their bill. Ask why did when your bills go up again this September, because unless they change the Virginia Clean Economy Act, your bill's going to go up again this September to buy digital credits called RECs, which longer story we can debate later. But look at your bill and ask why they go up. And that's what you should be. That's what every Virginian should be modeling it by. Are your bills going up and why are they going up? And if it's just fuel costs going up, look, we all know what inflation means, right? But if it's going up because of other things, because of what you see these riders on your bill, then call your legislator. But don't blame your utility company for your bills going up because it's not their fault. I can tell you, having been in the legislature, utilities do what they're told to do by the General Assembly. And when they're told to build stuff or go buy digital certificates to make people feel better, they have to go do it, and it shows up in your bills.
Well, Glenn, thank you so much for joining us today. That's unfortunately all the time that we have for this segment. But just thank you so much for the conversation.
I enjoyed it. Thank you for having me.
I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Put your hands together for Axios Live host, Eugene Scott.
Good morning. Thanks again, Sabrina. That was a wonderful conversation. I'm Eugene Scott. I'm a moderator here for Axios Live, and I want to thank once again our sponsor, Shell, for today's event. For their support of this program, we're now going to have one of them come and talk to us about what it is they're doing here in Virginia. I want to bring to the stage Shell Energy Solutions CEO, David Black.
Thanks, Eugene.
Thanks for coming.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
So first, I want to start with the title of our session here. Can you give me the headline on what the overall state of play is in Virginia when we think of energy?
Sure. And interesting to follow the director because I think he hit on a lot of things that I think most of us probably understand. I think Virginia's in a really unique situation right now. Lots of opportunity, but a lot of challenges. I think everybody understands that there's the load growth, and again, the director mentioned, over 5%. I think he quoted 6.5% load growth. We haven't seen that in my lifetime, and I've been at this about 30 years. So you have this wonderful opportunity that's out there of potentially bringing in new businesses in Virginia as a Commonwealth, maintaining its place as being a wonderful place to do business. But it's a challenge in how are we going to serve this and how are we going to meet it. At the same time, you've got a new administration that's coming in, and they need to figure out how are we going to navigate that. And again, I think you have to give them some time to figure that out. But we really see it as an opportunity. But again, it's also a challenge. And so how do you figure out what's the right balance of addressing some of these problems? And I think there's a lot of solutions. I think as you heard the director say, there's a lot of things you can do. I think what we feel is to focus on what can be done today. Because we can talk about some things and nuclear and things like that, but that stuff, fusion, right? That stuff's going to be decades, years away. But what can you do today? And so I think Virginia has this challenge right now. What are we going to do? And I think he's right. It's what do the people want to have happen? And so we view that there are some things that can be done. One of the things that we think that plays into, as he said, that you can do right now that alleviates some of the pressure because you have all this demand. And how are you going to meet it is to allow some level of customer choice. So you have a certain group of customers, we think of them as commercial industrials, we kind of use the acronym C&I, and let them choose so they're not having to buy from Dominion. Because right now, Virginia imports 30% of the power that it needs. That's a lot, right? Well, let's put a little escape valve on that and let these customers choose how can I buy my power? Do I want to buy it in a different manner? So it's a really unique time. It's kind of exciting. In some ways, you hope you live through these times, but it'd be interesting to see kind of where we end up.
So to your point, this is a pivotal time for energy in Virginia. Can you talk me through some of the highlights of what competition and limited retail choice mean and why it's important to Virginians to consider this?
Yeah, so I work for Shell, and we do this, frankly, around the globe. We're in all kinds of countries and various levels of competition. And I think most people in this room would agree that competition generally is a very good thing, right? Brings innovation, brings down cost. And so we believe that allowing for some level of retail choice for customers to choose, hey, how do I procure? When do I procure? What does that look like? Is a good thing. Now, to be clear, we're not talking about, and this is kind of these buzzwords that comes out, we're not talking about deregulation, right? Dominion, AEP, co-ops, so stay here. It's allowing a certain group of customers, and this, in our example, the commercial industrial sectors, tend to be very sophisticated buyers, giving them the flexibility to procure what they want, how they want, when they want. I was had dinner the other night, and we were talking with someone that, Dominion can only offer a tariff that's out there, it's published, and they have to offer it to everyone else. Well, what if you have a customer who's advanced manufacturing, they're coming here, and they've got a wonderful technology, but for the first couple of years, they really need to invest in hiring the right talent, building out the facility. they need to keep their costs low. Well, okay, well, we can structure a contract that says, hey, the first couple of years we'll charge you this, and that couple of years we'll charge you that. It's still the same cost. We're shifting, but it helps that customer to meet their needs. And so I think being able to provide that flexibility to customers, we can put, structures in place where someone says, well, I have a budget, and if prices ever go above this price, that's bad for me. Okay, well, I can put a cap on that, put a floor on it. We can do, third party can offer so much more. And so that's really what we're talking about, is providing that flexibility.
Okay, so then what's the biggest challenge or opportunity as well that Virginia faces when it comes to the power sector? And can Virginians do anything to address this?
Certainly you can, right? We're humans. We have freedom of choice. And again, I think the director highlighted a lot of different opportunities that are out there. But I think a lot of it is about having open dialogue, right? In the open. I'm looking in the back, I see him just like, but having open conversations about what is and isn't happening. These are very complex issues, at least on the surface. If you spend a little time, it's really not. Talking about supply and demand, right? These are not super complex, but you have to take the time to invest and understand what is driving some of this. And again, the situation that Virginia finds itself in is, again, you have this massive opportunity of growth. And that growth can bring tax dollars, right? It can bring jobs. I mean, these are good things, but Virginia has a challenge. And if you don't get this right, you will crowd out investment. And I think that's what we see. I serve a lot of customers who are in Virginia. I don't serve them today, but are in other jurisdictions, and they want us to serve them. And I'm like, well, I can't. And people are making decisions, and some of these are, billion-dollar decisions on where am I going to build this thing. And if there's no clarity and there's no certainty, markets like certainty, they're going to go other places. They're going to go to Georgia. They're going to go to Ohio. They're going to go to Texas. And so I think it's about having that open conversation and being honest. I think there's 1,000 things we can do, right? But what are the least amount of things that we should do to get this right today? Because what you don't want to do, and at least our experience is, you don't want to have radical change, because it's going to often have unintended consequences, because the markets are very complex. So what are incremental changes that you can make that allow you to take a step in the right direction? And so we think something like retail choice is an easy step. It's not very complex, and it's something you can do now.
So speaking of open conversations, the Virginia Assembly is in session right now, and we know they're looking at various options to address some of the challenges you just talked about. Are there options at this point that you think they really should consider?
I do, and I'm not gonna lie. I don't have all the bills. I'm not from Virginia, but certainly there are a lot of interesting bills out there. Delegate Lopez has a bill that is touching on this retail choice aspect, where right now it's very cumbersome for a customer to to choose to leave someone, because if you leave, you have to give a 5-year notice if you ever want to go back. Well, who's gonna make those decisions, right? It just blocks you out, right? Because you're like, well, I don't know what's going to happen, so I'm never going to leave. So there's a bill that looks to say, okay, well, look, let's make that 12 months, right? I can move in and out between Dominion and someone else 12 months. That seems pretty simple. I think Senator Van Valkenburg has a bill that allows smaller commercial industrial customers to aggregate. So right now there's a threshold where you can't go out and buy power if you're below a certain size. Well, now you can aggregate up, get 2 or 3 companies together and say, okay, we're now of a size we can go shop. So again, making it easier for folks to have choice. And then there's a host of other, bills. I think Senator Lucas has an interesting bill. DeSteph has some bills. Things that are addressing, again, different parts. So some of them are about, bringing batteries to market and different types of technology. There's a lot of stuff that's going on out there, for me to opine on what's going to get through, who knows? But I think it feels like there's a lot of energy behind it, and it feels like there's a lot of focus on it. So I'm optimistic that something will get done and allow Virginia to stay a wonderful place to do business.
Awesome. Well, we really want to thank you for coming today to talk about what it is that Shell's doing in Virginia and to give attendees more knowledge about what it is you want to do next in the future.
Sounds great.
Thanks. And we are unfortunately out of time, but not for this event, just this conversation. And we look forward to having you back here soon.
Sounds great.
Great.
Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Axios Energy and Climate Editor Chuck McCutcheon.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for sticking around. I'm Chuck McCutcheon. I'm Energy and Climate Editor. I edit the Axios Future of Energy newsletter, which is free, comes out every morning around this time. And we write a lot about data centers, like everybody else, and a lot about the legislation and the business decisions and the policies that are driving the whole sort of energy transition. Really looking forward. I'm going to be hosting the next two conversations. Please join me in welcoming the Southern Environmental Law Center staff attorney and a member of Governor Spanberger's energy transition team, Josephus Allman. Welcome to Axios. So I'm sure a lot of people are here because they want to know about sort of what Governor Spanberger's plans are. Can you just talk very broadly about the transition team and how you approached your work in the process?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks so much for having me and the Southern Environmental Law Center to share our perspective here. It was an honor to serve on Governor Spanberger's energy transition team and did so with a couple good friends and colleagues, Angela Navarro and Will Cleveland. And over the course of the couple months in between election and inauguration, we worked, and I think you heard a little bit with Director Davis about working with the different agencies and secretariats to figure out where their priorities were and budgets to help inform the administration as it's coming into play, but also getting together a really diverse team of stakeholders to round out the committee. So we had a representative from Shell, we had representatives from the environmental community, climate community, conservation, the chief operating officer of Columbia Gas, and so a lot of diverse perspectives at the table to inform an agenda that's focused on clean, affordable, and reliable energy over the next 4 years. So how to do that in the near term with some actions at the legislature, and then some longer term strategies, thinking about regulatory work that the administration could do.
Yeah, was there anything, again, broadly that surprised you the most about what sort of emerged from all this?
I think there was actually a lot of consensus about looking at data centers in our committee and trying to get them to contribute towards Virginia's clean energy goals and finding different ways in which they could fund different clean energy projects on their own.
Right.
And we're actually seeing that in legislation this session with Delegate Reed.
Right.
He's got a bill to expand the Accelerated Renewable Energy Buyer Program.
Right.
And that's a program that is good for data centers, allows them to contract for clean energy, but at the same time, it's good for the rest of the ratepayers because ratepayers are shielded from those costs, but also any electricity that they buy through those contracts is subtracted out from the utility's RPS obligation.
Right.
So it lowers the rest of what we have to pay the rest of the rate base.
Yeah, and again, I think I asked you about this earlier, but sort of, were you looking at this, realizing you were like, gee, you know, the whole country is watching what we're doing in Virginia in terms of data centers. You know, we can really sort of establish what we do here as kind of a model for the rest of the country.
Yeah, exactly. What we're looking at is a big challenge, but that also means it's a big opportunity. And so looking at Northern Virginia, some of the transmission constraints, we think batteries can be really helpful for that and a number of other challenges. And so that's why we're working really closely with Delegate Sullivan and Senator Bagby on a bill that would dramatically expand energy storage in Virginia.
This was the bill that Governor Youngkin vetoed last year?
Correct, and it's a more ambitious bill than even that, and so it's a larger target for short duration storage. It also has a carve out for distributed storage projects, which go on the distribution system, smaller projects, but can really provide some localized benefits in terms of congestion reduction, and those are some of the highest prices that Virginia customers pay in the PJM region.
Yeah. Can you talk about some of the other bills that you're tracking? I think you've mentioned a couple already, but are there any others that you mentioned distributed expansion? What are some of the others?
Yeah, so another bill that is a repeat from last year with Delegate Carlson and Senator Van Valkenburg, a bill to expand the use of distributed generation, so small-scale storage.
Right.
Right now, it's only 1% of the VCEA, and these bills would bring that up to 5%. That also increases the amount of solar that we're placing on previously developed sites, so places like brownfields and parking lots. And if you've been paying attention in Virginia to the pushback that we've seen for utility scale solar at the rural level, shifting more development towards those built environment locations is really important, I think, for building acceptance of solar throughout the Commonwealth. That's one, and we're rejoining RGGI through bills from Delegate Herring,
Right.
And Senator Locke, and really looking forward to getting back into that program, seeing some of the benefits from emissions reductions, and also the funding that goes towards weatherizing homes and providing benefits through energy efficiency upgrades to low-income Virginians.
I wanted to ask you about RGGI, which is been, I guess, sort of controversial. Last week, the U.S. Energy Secretary Chris Wright sort of dinged Governor Spanberger for wanting to rejoin RGGI, which he called essentially a tax on non-wind and non-solar generation. Can you sort of address why your views on RGGI?
Yeah, I think it places a price on the sort of unrealized externalities of fossil fuel production. And so what we saw when we were in RGGI last was over a 20% reduction in carbon emissions and the localized air pollutants that go with it. That is tangible health benefits for the communities in which those facilities are sited. But it also generates revenue that goes towards weatherization, energy efficiency, things that lower the overall system need. And so the money is helping sort of right-size where our energy is being produced, and also helping flow benefits to some of the most sort of vulnerable Virginians.
Okay. He also was saying that, during the recent storm, he was like, where did Virginia get more than 90% of its electricity? It wasn't from wind, it wasn't from solar. Sort of trying to make the case for fossil fuels. Can you sort of address that?
Yeah, I think this is sort of a common misconception that the environmental community is pushing for an overnight replacement of all of our fossil resources. That's not the case. The Clean Economy Act doesn't require retirement for 20 years. And so I think it's important to look at where we are on that trajectory towards getting 100% clean. But you can look at other states and other regional grids and how they perform during similar storms that are more advanced in their renewable development. And they saw significant contributions from wind and solar and batteries, especially during those winter storms. And so looking at PJM, there's a small contribution from solar. Part of the problem is PJM only added 2 gigawatts of generation to the grid last year. Texas, ERCOT is half the size, serves half the customers that PJM does, added almost 30 gigawatts last year. We've got to fix the problem at PJM, getting resources connected so that they can help contribute. Even Dominion, in their most recent RPS case, is talking about how solar benefited the grid during Winter Storm Fern. It served those sort of those lulls in the afternoon and allowed their dispatchable generation to hold off during those periods so that it was free to meet demand later on. So it's a grid that we need all sources to contribute to at the moment, and then as we're looking 10 and 20 years in the future, thinking about how those advanced technologies like SMRs can come into play, how long duration storage can help us ride out some of those longer periods. So I think it's sort of a mischaracterization, and I think we just have to sort of realize that we're at the beginning of a progression, working to get there by 2045 or 2050 in the case of APCO.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, in terms of looking down the road in the future, Virginia obviously now gets a lot of its energy from natural gas, but there has been talk about, bringing in more solar and more other kinds of storage. Governor Youngkin talked about an SMR, small modular reactor. What do you see Virginia's energy mix being like in a decade or so?
Yeah, I think it's going to be diverse, and I think it's going to be clean. You mentioned the SMRs. We've talked a lot with a company called Commonwealth Fusion Systems.
Yeah, they've
developing
down in
projects
Chesterfield County, right?
So we're hopeful that that technology pans out.
Right.
Because, fusion could be a real game changer.
Right.
But we've also got a lot of solar that's called for in the Clean Economy Act. There are a couple of bills to pretty significantly increase the size of our shared solar programs and get about another 600 megawatts of small-scale solar generation on the grid. And then we've got Dominion's offshore wind project, which is sort of back on track after a hiccup with the administration. But that is 2.6 gigawatts of clean capacity that's going to be delivered and really help during those nighttime hours. So I think it's going to be a diverse grid. We're seeing even advancements in enhanced geothermal.
Right.
There could be places in Virginia where that could be more viable in the future. So I think it's good to keep our options open as we think about what can contribute towards 100% clean grid.
Okay, all right. You and I also talked about environmental justice, and you had said a lot of what's missing are we making sure that we're not falling into the same traps of siting in Black and brown and poor communities? Can you sort of elaborate on that?
Sure. And we've seen a lot of this over the past sort of couple of years as we've started to build out this AI infrastructure throughout the country. A few months ago, I was down in Memphis at an event hosted by the NAACP, and that's where Elon Musk and XAI have their Grok data center, where they basically shipped in 30 gas turbines without pollution controls and without permits and started running them for a year in an environmental justice community. Meta is building a 2.3 gigawatt gas plant in Louisiana to fuel their new data center there, and that gas plant is not going in the suburbs of Baton Rouge. And then here in Virginia, where we're building new gas peakers to serve primarily data center load.
Right.
Dominion's first proposal for a new gas plant was at the site of the old Chesterfield coal plant. And so it seems like in the rush to build out these AI facilities in the name of national security and AI dominance, we're overlooking something that we've already done for the past few decades, which is take the easy route and site polluting resources in poor and minority communities and hope that they don't push back or have the political capital to stop those projects. We want to make sure that these data centers come here and that they're benefiting the grid and that they're benefiting the local communities, not harming them. And so how can we get more battery storage on site? There's a great demand flexibility bill from Delegate Feggins and Senator McPike, because instead of building new capital-intensive resources to serve all these facilities, well, there's been some great research to show that if they just turn their operations down for 10, 20, 100 hours during the year, during peak times, then that can actually free up a lot of capacity and allow some of these resources to come in without new generation. And so I think it's a comprehensive strategy about looking at different ways where they can offset their impacts to the grid, so they don't have to depend on these dirty, polluting resources to come in and fuel their operations.
Okay. We're almost out of time, but I wanted to just ask you to just give any final thoughts about sort of what we should be watching for, both from the Assembly and from the governor and otherwise in terms of Virginia here in the near term over the next couple of years.
I'd say just look broadly at the comprehensive approach that's coming out of the General Assembly. We've got bills that are promoting small-scale storage, shared solar, bills that are looking at how we get more out of the grid we have through grid-enhancing technologies and advanced transmission technologies. And I think when we're talking about affordability and how policies advance affordability, it's important to consider in comparison to what. Because if we're not building all of these clean resources to help meet this new need, then we're going to have to build new gas resources. And those are expensive, both in terms of the initial capital expenditure to build them, the financing costs to pay them off over time, but then for the fuel that they require for the full 35-year lifetime. Solar and wind don't have fuel costs for their entire life. And so we need to be focusing on those things that reduce our exposure to fuel cost volatility, which is only increasing as we sort of focus on dramatically increasing LNG exports. So I think that comparison to what, as we're thinking about affordability and realizing that this comprehensive clean approach is the way that's going to keep costs down as we deal with rising demand and continue on our way to our clean energy transition.
Okay, well, with that, unfortunately, we're out of time, but thank you so much for these insights, Josephus. Thanks again.
Thank you so much for having me.
So up next, please join me in welcoming energy columnist for Virginia Mercury, Ivy Main, to the stage. Hi, Ivy. Thanks for coming.
Thank you for having me.
So thanks for joining us this morning. I'll ask you kind of a similar question to what I asked Josephus, which is kind of very broadly, what are you expecting from the Spanberger administration and the Assembly on energy in the near term?
So what we're seeing this session is massive interest in the two fundamental problems here of data center growth and the effect on energy consumption and energy prices. And everybody's got ideas. So there are more bills on energy and data centers than there have ever been. What we're seeing moving through is a whole lot of kind of small and medium fixes.
Right.
There's clearly no appetite for doing the big stuff. Nobody wants to just stop the data center build out because that would solve your affordability problems if you just stopped the industry that is driving them. That is clearly a non-starter. The economic development attractiveness of the data center industry is such that there's no interest in doing that. There's a lot of grassroots interest. I will say that if you did some public polling, you'd find a whole lot of interest in a moratorium.
Oh, yeah.
What we're seeing instead is how can we make fixes to the existing system, tweaking it, and there's a lot of good evidence that tweaking it can get you a long way. So we're talking about how much peak load the system needs, but there are ways to get that peak load down through shifting, using the infrastructure better, shifting demand to non-peak times. So lots and lots of bills doing that, and a lot of them are going through, and that's really heartening. In the past, it was very, very hard to make changes to how we do energy. And there's a much greater willingness now to move these bills through. I think the sense of urgency is real.
Oh, okay. So accordingly, though, you were saying that you're not going to see, quote unquote, like the big fix. So does that mean that this is something that is going to have to be revisited again and again for several years and several legislative sessions?
I think so. Now, it is reasonable to start out. Governor Spanberger's got a Democratic majority for 2 years, so it is reasonable for her to look at the first year as let's do the things that are achievable without great pain, and see how far we can get, and then next year revisit that and do things that maybe are more painful, but maybe there'd be more political will if we've tried everything else first.
Okay. Talking about the legislature, you wrote about, for the Mercury, you're interested in the legislature addressing this issue of diesel generators,
Yes.
providing backup power in emergencies. Can you talk about why that's important?
So there are a couple of reasons. One is that the pollution from diesel generators is creating a local air quality problem. And researchers at Virginia Commonwealth University have looked at this and said, you know, it is fairly concentrated at the moment, but when you look at what all of the permits allow, the impacts could be enormous if they all start running at once to the levels permitted. And so that is a concern in itself. I also think it is, you know, you've got carbon emissions from these that are just not caught under any program. And it just strikes me as a really inefficient way to do things. When we know we need more energy storage, and if the first couple of hours of backup power were provided by energy storage, we would go a long way towards solving some of these peak demand issues, because they could be using those the backup storage to help the grid at the same time. And so this seems to me a real failure of policy here, that the data centers are putting in these very highly polluting generators when for a little bit more money they could be helping solve the problems.
Yeah, you talked about, you know, almost doubling the targets for short-term energy storage that have been laid out in the Clean Economy Act, and then the targets for long-duration storage. Can you also talk about some of the other bills that either were failed or vetoed last year? I mean, you mentioned expanding rooftop solar in the renewable portfolio standard, you know, balcony solar, you know, carve out for geothermal heat pumps, some of the others.
Right, so these are all, again, kind of small fixes, but things that we didn't get through last year,
Right.
but have had trouble in past years, and we're seeing a great deal more understanding that distributed generation contributes to the grid situation, that one of the ways you can address the data center growth is by having more of the load taken off the utilities' shoulders and done by customers on their own dime and out in the communities where it also helps to provide resilience. So I think Josephus Allman was talking about the distributed generation expansion bill, which in addition to raising the amount of distributed solar that would be brought into the renewable portfolio standard, it also then takes the limits off of power purchase agreements so that homeowners can use those. Now that the federal tax credits have gone away for homeowners to own solar directly, they can do it through a power purchase agreement or a lease agreement, and that makes it affordable again. You can still use the tax credits for another couple of years. So, and then there's a task force that is going to look at how do we continue to incentivize distributed generation. There's several different other approaches. There's a grant fund. We'll see. It's interesting to me that a lot of these things that cost money are coming through the legislature, but they got to get into the budget as well.
Right.
And we'll see what happens with those.
It's always the rub, yeah. Let's also talk about RGGI. You know, during our conversation last week, I mentioned that the Energy Secretary, Chris Wright, kind of dinged Governor Spanberger for wanting to rejoin RGGI. He called it essentially a carbon tax on non-wind and non-solar. And you talked about how you really need a market force like RGGI, and how in Texas, you know, we saw that wind and solar actually were helpful during the recent storm. Can you sort of elaborate on your thoughts about rejoining RGGI?
Yeah, so the whole point of having a carbon fee is to send that market signal so that the utilities now have a reason to invest in renewable energy and to ratchet down their reliance on fossil fuels. And I mean, we have to remember that in 2020, when we passed the Virginia Clean Economy Act and put Virginia into the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, part of the reason was climate change, which is a huge problem, and ignoring it doesn't make it go away.
Right.
But the other half of the problem was this is how you're going to save money in the long term, is that the energy transition makes sense because wind and solar are the cheapest forms of energy, and they will continue to get cheaper, whereas fossil fuels, they can't get cheaper. So, and in fact, now that we're exporting all kinds of liquefied natural gas, gas has doubled in price, and who knows where it will go. So you've got that huge volatility problem. So it makes sense to be doing these investments into renewable energy. And RGGI turns out to be a really good, efficient market system for doing that.
Okay. So we've talked about the governor, we've talked about the assembly. Then I wanted to now talk about PJM. Much maligned, obviously, and under a lot of criticism. What do you make of sort of how they've responded to all this criticism from so many different governors and others, and now the Trump administration's efforts to try to, nudge them along?
Yeah, there was a real failure there to understand the transition to wind and solar, and to change their processes to get these things into their queue. They've got all of these projects, 90% of them are wind and solar and batteries, and they don't have a process to move them through quickly. So they've had these 5-year lag times when a project enters the queue to when it can actually connect. And they were not in a position where they could keep up even with normal demand, and then to have the data center boom suddenly adding all this pressure on the grid. They really weren't in a position to do that. In addition, they don't value the capacity value of wind and solar very highly. So there is a lot of wind and solar and storage that can make up that capacity, and they're simply not using an approach that would give those adequate values. So their problems are of their own making in large part. And I'm not a PJM expert, so I probably have to leave it there.
Okay, all right. Can you sort of talk about some of the other emerging energy technologies and ways to power the state that you see emerging? There's offshore wind. Josephus mentioned offshore wind. There's small modular reactors. I think, were skeptical about Governor Youngkin's talk about that. Can you sort of talk about some of those and any others that you see?
Yeah, well, offshore wind is obviously happening.
Back on track, at least. Right.
CVOW will start delivering power this spring,
right,
and be done by the end of the fall. So that is going to be a huge boost to our energy supply. Dominion has several other projects that are in the works. Their timeline is such that they can kind of wait out the Trump administration. I think it's really important to recognize that the hostility to offshore wind is really just him. I mean, nobody else feels this way, and he will be gone, and then we will get back on track. And you can even see this in the General Assembly. We've got a couple of offshore wind bills to build a workforce, and if people didn't believe there was a future in offshore wind, you wouldn't need those. But those passed by bipartisan majorities. So everybody is recognizing that offshore wind is in our future still, that there's still a lot to do. And it's important because we are a coastal state, and the whole Northeast region down through Virginia, it is hard to build new transmission. So if you can build your new generation and transmission offshore. That is a source of generation that is much, much easier to access. And I think that is why it is so important to the Northeast, because they are so grid constrained. And it is important to Virginia as well that we be able to bring that on. So, and we've seen in Europe, those prices keep coming down and down. So we know that once we build our own industry here, that it will be a major source of generation. And it has pretty high capacity factors, 50% or so. So it is a significant contributor. I'm very psyched by geothermal, the deep ground, what Fervo and Sage geosystems are doing out west. It's going to be a few years before they do it here, because the hot rocks are a lot closer to the surface out in Colorado and Wyoming and or Nevada, I guess, and that they're not as close to the surface here, so you have to go down many more miles. But there are places, I think Josephus mentioned, where we think we could get it earlier here. That's an enormous source of 24/7 power, so that'll be great. You're right, I am more skeptical of nuclear, because we're not seeing the things that we would want to see for it to be a commercially viable source.
Okay.
If you could, if you can solve the safety problems, the waste problems, and the economic problems, then that's great. But we've got to see that first.
Exactly, yeah. Well, with that, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Ivy, for your time and for joining us this morning. And thank you, everyone, for coming to spend your morning with us. And thanks to those of you who tuned in on the live stream. And a reminder, please subscribe to our newsletters, Axios Richmond and Future of Energy, to get all the latest news and scoops and information about what's going on. You can do it at axios.com/newsletters. Thanks again for coming, and we'll see you next time.